welcome back to The Explainer. All right, let's just dive right into this. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating and honestly a pretty sobering chapter of history, the ethical blind spots of 20th century government science. We're going to examine exactly what happens when the relentless pursuit of strategic national goals completely overrides basic, fundamental ethical boundaries. So I want you to hold this specific question in your mind as we go through things today. What actually happens when the pursuit of science completely ignores ethics? When government authorities get tunnel vision on a specific objective, who or what ends up paying the price for unchecked experimentation? Now, the scope of what we're looking at today spans two wildly different, seemingly totally unrelated realms. We've got the human body on one side and the vast expanse of outer space on the other. But as you're about to see, they share a very powerful parallel story of government overreach. Here is the roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the era of unchecked experiments, starting with the Tuskegee syphilis study and its legacy of distrust. Then, we'll pivot to Project Westford, the astronomical backlash it caused. And finally, we'll wrap up with how we're rebuilding trust and ethics. All right, Section 1, the Tuskegee syphilis study, a medical tragedy. This is a profoundly solemn part of American history, and it requires our absolute utmost respect to truly understand the depth of this ethical failure. The crucial point of this tragedy revolves around this number right here, 399. Starting in 1932, the United States Public Health Service initiated a study involving 399 poor, extremely vulnerable Black sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama. These men were deliberately deceived by the physicians conducting the study. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, which was just a vague term used at the time. But in reality, they were simply being used to document the natural history of syphilis without receiving any actual medical care. When you trace this timeline, the sheer magnitude of the ethical blind spot just becomes agonizingly clear. Initiated in 1932, the study continued right on through the 1940s. Now, that's absolutely crucial because the 1940s was a time when penicillin had become the standard, highly effective treatment for syphilis. Yet, government officials went to extreme lengths to deliberately withhold this life-saving medication from the men in the study. They just wanted to continue observing the disease's progression unhindered. And this deception, this denial of care, it didn't just last for a few months. It dragged on for decades, all the way until 1972. The horrific reality of this government experiment only came to a halt when the public finally caught wind of it. On July 26, 1972, the New York Times published a front-page article with this totally devastating headline: Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. This exposure publicly revealed the details of what is widely considered the longest non-therapeutic human experiment in medical history, and it finally brought the whole thing to a grinding halt. Moving on to Section 2. A legacy of distrust, the long shadow. The end of the study definitely wasn't the end of the story. The medical community's ultimate betrayal of these men caused these deep, generational wounds that fundamentally altered the relationship between African Americans and public health institutions. Decades later, a formal effort was finally made to address this. In 1996, the Syphilis Study Legacy Committee was formed, and they had two main objectives. First, to persuade the President of the United States to issue a formal public apology, because that hadn't happened yet. And second, to develop a tangible strategy to actually redress the damages. This included creating a professionally staffed center at Tuskegee for public education and establishing really specific training programs for healthcare providers on research ethics. And the committee's report makes this incredibly clear. The Tuskegee study cast a long, long shadow of deep suspicion. This historical trauma remains a significant, ongoing factor for low participation among African Americans in clinical trials and even organ donation efforts today. It literally fuels a reluctance to seek routine preventative medical care. When the government breaks trust that severely, the ripple effects impact preventative health for generations. All right, Section 3. Project Westford, the space race. So, while the medical community was failing vulnerable citizens down on the ground, the military was looking upward into the intense, high-stakes era of the Cold War. And to understand their ethical blind spots, we really have to look at the military's biggest fear at the time, a high-altitude nuclear blast. They were terrified that a blast like that could destroy the Earth's natural ionosphere, which would completely wipe out long-range, high-frequency radio communications. So scientists came up with a wild concept: an artificial ionosphere. They wanted to create a continuous, jam-proof orbital belt of reflective material to make sure military microwave communications could survive a nuclear attack. Now, what's really fascinating here is, instead of launching a traditional satellite, the military planned to launch tiny filaments of copper wire. They called them dipoles or just needles, and they'd use this Project West Ford dipole dispenser to get them up there. To deploy them, these copper needles were actually embedded in a solid block of naphthalene inside this dispensing device. The idea was that once it got into space, the naphthalene would sublimate, basically turn into gas, slowly releasing the needles so they could disperse along their orbit and form a literal ring around the entire Earth. Which brings us to Section 4, the astronomical backlash, a threat to the sky. The U.S. military designed this massive orbital experiment largely in secret. They didn't really widely consult the global scientific community. And when astronomers around the world finally found out, the panic was immediate, and it was driven by the sheer scale of the project. The military wasn't just launching a handful of these reflectors. We're talking about several 100 million of these tiny copper dipoles being launched into orbit. The goal was to build a highly reflective artificial cloud in space, which is for sure exactly what scientists studying the cosmos did not want. As you might guess, the international astronomical community was furious. In fact, one astronomer very dramatically compared the experiment to setting fire to the last forest. They saw this as a profound threat to a pristine natural resource. There was genuine, serious fear that if the military successfully ringed the Earth with copper wire, humanity might permanently lose its unhindered view of the night sky. And this international fury, it was completely grounded in very specific scientific concerns. Astronomers worried the dipole belt would be opaque to microwave signals coming from deep space, effectively blinding radio astronomy. For optical telescopes down on the ground, there was a fear that hundreds of millions of copper needles would scatter light and create this diffuse glow across the whole sky. On top of all that, no one knew for sure if future spacecraft would suffer catastrophic collisions when trying to fly through this metallic belt. It was basically a massive roll of the dice with the cosmos. Section 5. Rebuilding Trust and Ethics. The Reckoning. So, whether we're looking at the deeply intimate betrayal of the Tuskegee subjects or the unilateral decision to basically alter the Earth's orbit with Project West Ford, both of these historical dark spots forced a major reckoning. Humanity had to step back and finally set strict ethical boundaries for scientific pursuit. And the outcry over these unchecked experiments directly paved the way for the systems we rely on today. On one side, the horror of the Tuskegee study became the starting point for modern moral reflection on human research, leading to the strict institutional review boards and the modern bioethics we have now. And on the other side, the international outrage over Project West Ford heavily influenced the framing of the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty, which literally became the cornerstone of international space law to prevent the unilateral pollution of orbit. As we see with the final report of the Syphilis Study Legacy Committee, acknowledging past wrongs really is the critical first step. You simply cannot rebuild trust or ensure equitable, safe science moving forward without transparently confronting the times when the government got it completely, devastatingly wrong. Documents like this represent a hard-won commitment to never letting such ethical breaches happen again. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy final question to ponder. Do our current technological leaps have sufficient ethical guardrails? Think about it. Today, we are seeing rapid, massive deployments of commercial satellite constellations in low Earth orbit, along with absolutely sweeping advancements in biotechnology. As you look at the news today, I want you to ask yourself, are we absolutely sure we aren't at risk of repeating these historical mistakes? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the tough questions.